Assalamu alaikum students, this is Dr. Asir Ajmal with lecture 13 of forensic psychology. We have been discussing psychology of violence, and in that context we have looked at Freud's theory of psychoanalysis, and we have now been discussing Jung's theory, or also called analytical psychology. In Jungian analytical psychology, we have looked at his concept of universal unconscious, collective unconscious, or what is also called the cultural or racial unconscious. And in that, I think the central issue is that of archetypes. So let's have a quick look at his archetypes. Once again, let me remind you that Jung's theory of analytical psychology is considered one of the most difficult psychological theories to understand. Many psychologists just avoid reading Jung because he is just very difficult to read and understand. And so my task would be to make him comprehensible, to make him understandable to you. So his archetypes. What are archetypes? Archetypes, according to Jung, are the earliest remnants of our past. They are like almost mythical creatures in our head, in our mind, and they represent different forces of our spirit, of our psyche. If you look at the slide here, where I'm showing you the different archetypes as they exist in Jung's analytical psychology, at the top is the shadow, which is our deepest, darkest, secret self, our bad qualities that we are never aware of, but we always see those qualities in other people. We always see those faults in other people. That is called the shadow. Then the child. The child is just like what the word means, the child in all of us. So that's self-explanatory. Then Great Mother. Great Mother is the fairy and the witch, the good mother and the bad mother, the nurturing mother and the devouring mother. But it's always great, because for a child there's nobody greater than the mother. Then there's the archetype of the hero, because as the child grows up, he wants to be a hero, he wants to be the ideal man. And then he could turn into the wise old man. Wise old man is the one who shows the light to hero when he's in trouble, when he's in the deepest, darkest forest and sees no way out. That's when the wise old man comes. Anima is the young woman inside a man. The young woman inside a man is strangely, ironically, not the equivalent of the hero. The anima, the young woman, is actually the wise woman. So she is the equivalent of the wise old man, because she also represents our spirit, जिसे हम उर्दू में और अरबी में रूह कहते हैं. That's what anima represents. It's the young woman who's wise, and it's the old man who's wise. Then animus is the male inside a woman, the male archetype within the woman. Then finally there is the pair of trickster and the self. Trickster is the one that tests the personality. The personality that has been through all of these archetypes is now tested, and once it passes the test, the self emerges. The self is Iqbal's khudi. It is not ego, it is not I, it is not मैं. जो हम कहते हैं ना कि हर शख्स की एक अना होती है, तो सेल्फ अना नहीं होती, सेल्फ खुदी होती है. Now, as I told you that the archetypes are one of the most difficult concepts to understand in psychology, I will try and give you examples with a view to understanding these archetypes in the context of violence. Okay? The idea that archetypal constellations, the combinations of archetypes, and whichever one is dominant, will determine what kind of personality you are, what kind of qualities are there in you. So let's take a look. Shadow when the shadow is the dominant part of the personality, the evil, the violence that the shadow would commit should be no rocket science to understand. Shadow क्योंकि उसमें नेगेटिव क्वालिटीज होती हैं बहुत सारी, और वो ऐसी नेगेटिव क्वालिटीज होती हैं जिनको खुद नहीं देख पाता इंसान और दूसरों में देखता है. That is when nations go to war. That is when countries with their very logically thinking, logically minded leaders attacking another country, saying they're the ones who are bad. Now that's a perfect example. We see that in the world around us all the time. We know that these are bad people, that these are evil people who are attacking poor, helpless countries around the world. But if you ask them, they say, we're great, we're fine. It is these bad people who are making us attack them. So, in this very twisted logic that the whole world can see, they alone cannot. These leaders cannot. And that is the perfect example of the shadow, where the man himself cannot see his shadow, cannot see his deepest, darkest qualities, deepest, darkest faults that are causing pain and suffering to others. So that's the kind of violence shadow produces. The child is also capable of violence. In fact, the child in an adult body is capable of even greater violence. The child wants everything now. The child wants pleasure. The child acts irresponsibly. The child behaves without any awareness of consequences. So what does the child do then? He resorts to violence if he is frustrated. He resorts to violence if he is angry. He resorts to violence if he wants to get something and it's not possible to get it. So that's the kind of violence the child is capable of. What about the great mother? The great mother, if you look at the archetype, on the one hand, as I said, it has a nurturing quality. The mother who feeds the child, the mother who holds the child lovingly, tenderly, in a caring way, is not capable of violence, except when the child is threatened. So the same mother who is holding the child and is the greatest provider of love and caring, if her baby is threatened, she becomes Kali Devi, she becomes Durga. She takes out her sword and slashes the enemy and even drinks their blood. She is so fearsome in her ability to protect. So that's another kind of violence that we do come across in people who are protective. When the great mother takes over, a lot of the violence is protective violence. It's the violence to protect the loved ones. It's the violence to protect the family. It's the violence to protect one's near and dear ones. So that is something we should keep in mind, that violence is not always on the side of evil, but it does break the law. So that's where we have to be aware that there would be a lot of violence from the side of the great mother that is actually protective and supportive, yet it is illegal. Then there's the violence by the hero. What does violence by the hero mean? Hero, again, by nature, is a violent, violent actor, a violent person. Why? Why do I say that? In the myths, you always find hero as fighting the enemy, fighting the villains. So fighting is violence, but this violence is in order to accomplish something good. So here, hero has something in common with the great mother. The great mother does violence to protect. The hero does violence to defend. And usually it's a cause. It's not relatives or family like as it is in the case of great mother. For hero, it's a noble cause. It's something bigger than everybody. It's something bigger than himself. So that's the kind of violence you get from the hero. Does the wise old man commit violence? The wise old man commits violence through treason, through treachery, through deceit. Now you would ask me, how can the wise old man deceive somebody? The wise old man typically would not deceive anybody. But when it's perverted, when it's overpowerful, when it's too much, then it would deceive. It would, because it doesn't have the strength to take things on directly. When it appears in the deepest, darkest forest to the hero, the perverted wise old man becomes the trickster, and instead of leading the hero to the goal, he lets him wander. He betrays him, shows him the wrong path. The enema typically does not commit violence. Is the archetype of the young woman within the man. In fact, even in the face of strongest violence, enema creates the way for peace. It creates the way for softening of the situation. And sometimes even legitimate violence, where legitimate violence is required, enema can create a weakness. And this is, I'm talking here about a perverted, a non-typical enema. So somebody is required to be violent, like a police officer on duty. He's being shot at, he's being fired at. He takes out his gun. Something tells him, oh, please don't shoot this guy. After all, he's a human being too. So that would be a perversion of the enema. When the enema is too dominant in a male, he would not be able to commit even justifiable violence. The animus in a woman, on the other hand, makes a woman more violent than she typically is. So if you see women who are showing extraordinary tendency towards violence towards others, she, according to Jung, would have a very strong animus. The male inside the woman is too strong in this case. Then the trickster perverted or dominant, can do extreme kinds of violence and can actually trick the person to believe, just like the shadow, that he's on the right, everybody else is on the wrong. And finally, the self. The self commits violence only in the name of God, and it's usually justifiable, and it's usually on the right cause. The violence that emanates from the self is what I would call holy violence. It is jihad, it is a crusade, it is a battle that you take up in the name of God. And not only are you convinced of it, but everybody else is convinced of it. So strong is the spiritual power of the violence that emanates from the self. It usually is in consistency with the law of the land. It typically does not violate the law. So here was one look at Jung's theory of violence. Now I asked you earlier to think about the theory of archetypes as if it is the theory of jinns. And I think this is a very important point that I'm making here. If you think about a man who is possessed by 10, 11 or 12 different genies or jinns, and these jinns are actually these different personalities. One jinn is childish, the other jinn is a woman, the other jinn is a wise old man, the other jinn is a hero, and so on. You can see how Jung actually sees the personality as made up of these different factors. We find that not every day, but quite often we find that people start to behave differently or strangely. Not only that they're mentally ill, but you find that somebody is just not behaving like they usually do. जैसे हम वो पंजाबी में कहते हैं जी खबरें नु की हो गया आज, and that is the kind of phenomenon that Jung's archetype will predict कि आज एक आर्कीटाइप जो है वो ऐसा डोमिनेंट हुआ है जो पहले कभी नजर नहीं आया आपको उस शख्सियत में. So and that can happen through different stressors or environmental things. So that I would say would sum up Jung's theory of violence. So we've talked about shadows violence. You know, we've talked about the wars that are fought in the name of a good cause. We've talked about the trickster's violence. The trickster's violence is about not only deceiving others, but is also deceiving oneself. We've also spoken about violence epidemics. And that violent epidemic जो है, ये violence की वबा जो है, वो क्या होती है? हमने देखा है कि कई मुल्कों में इस तरह शुरू हो जाता है. एक दफ़ा एक वायलेंट एक्ट हुआ, फिर दूसरा हुआ, फिर तीसरा हुआ, फिर चौथा हुआ, फिर ऐसे जैसे कोई बीमारी फैलती है उसी तरह वायलेंस भी फैल जाता है. एंड दैट वुड फिट इन विद युंग्स साइकोलॉजी, क्योंकि युंग एक कलेक्टिव अनकॉन्शियस की बात करता है, एक इज्तिमाई लाशऊर की बात करता है कि पूरी कौम जो है उसमें तशद्दुद शुरू हो जाता है. And that violence epidemic is in fact a manifestation of the collective unconscious. Wars and riots, they are examples of violence epidemics. And then chaos within the psyche, which is जब आपकी जहन में, दिमाग में इंतशार इतना बढ़ जाए कि ये जो मुख्तलिफ आर्कीटाइप्स हैं ये मिल के काम करने की बजाय अलग अलग अपना अपना करने लगे कुछ, तो शख्सियत बिखर जाती है, उसका शिराजा बिखर जाता है, इंतशार पैदा हो जाता है और इस इंतशार की वजह से भी वायलेंस जो है वो रिजल्ट कर सकता है. So I hope you have understood Jung's theory. I mean, I've spent considerable time on Jung. We talked about it in the previous lecture as well, because he is difficult to understand. And I hope you understand that, because, you know, when you will be tested on this in your quiz, hopefully you will be able to answer the questions correctly. And I would urge you to look at the handouts. So read them carefully and try and answer the questions, keeping in mind the idea that archetypes are like jinns that have possessed the personality. Now I want to introduce a totally different perspective. This would not only change the way you think about violence, but think the way you change about life, about the mind, about the spirit, about the soul, about the psyche. This is called the behaviorist perspective, the perspective that claimed to be the only scientific perspective on psychology in the 20th century. And that is why I think it's very important for us to thoroughly understand not only the historical context, but the ins and outs of how behaviorism works. It starts with an interesting story. Like most science, there was a man called Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov, in what was Soviet Union or Russian Empire prior to that. And Pavlov in the Soviet Union was a psychologist who was interested in the hunger and the salivation response of dogs. Now, Pavlov was, as I said, a Russian psychologist who was studying dogs by inserting a tube behind their jaw, right? So I want you to understand this experimental framework, because otherwise you would not be able to understand what was going on. A tube was inserted right under the jaw, and from that tube, when a dog salivated, the flow of saliva through the tube was contained in a beaker which had measurements on it. And that way, the salivation response of the dog was measured in response to hunger. A very simple task. I was a psychologist trying to understand this phenomenon. But then something happened that turned the way, that changed the way psychology looked at human instincts and human behavior forever. This is very important to understand. Okay, so here is Pavlov with a dog whose mouth is connected to a beaker via a tube, and where the saliva is flowing and the flow of the saliva is being measured. Something strange happened. The man who delivered the meat for the dog would ring a bell before he came. And Pavlov noticed that while typically, the dog salivated every time it saw the meat, over a period of time, the dog started to salivate when he heard the bell. This was puzzling for Pavlov. What happened? Why is the dog salivating to the bell? It's not very difficult to understand that the dog was pairing the bell with the meat in his mind. But we don't know what mind is. We don't know, जिसे हम ज़हन कहते हैं उर्दू में, वो दिमाग नहीं है. दिमाग एक अलग चीज़ है, ज़हन एक अलग चीज़ है. दिमाग एक हकीकी ऑर्गन है, it's a part of our body. ज़हन हमारे ज़हन की इख्तिरा, right? We're assuming that we have a mind. Pavlov didn't worry too much whether something was happening in the mind or not, because he was a scientist. What he was interested in was that when ringing of the bell comes just before the provision of the meat to the dog, so this pairing is what Pavlov called association. And association actually, as we understand, just means connection, link, ताल्लुक जिसे हम कहते हैं. तो घंटी की आवाज़ जो थी, जो मीट डिलीवरी मैन बजाता था और जब वो गोश्त डिलीवर करता था, तो क्या हुआ कि कुत्ते ने घंटी की आवाज़ सुन के सेलिब्रेट करना शुरू कर दिया. और इसको बिहेवियरिज्म में हम कहते हैं क्लासिकल कंडीशनिंग. क्लासिकल कंडीशनिंग हम इसे क्यों कहते हैं, ये हम अभी बाद में बात करेंगे. लेकिन ये कंडीशनिंग क्यों कहलाती? कंडीशनिंग का मतलब ये है कि किसी एक चीज को किसी और चीज से कंडीशन कर दिया जाए, किसी और चीज के साथ उसका ताल्लुक कायम कर दिया जाए, बार बार उसे उसके साथ पेश करने से. यानी अगर आप सिर्फ एक दफा घंटी बजाई और बाकी दफा दरवाजा खटखटाया है, तो फिर वो सेलिब्रेट घंटी पे नहीं करेगा, बल्कि दरवाजा खटखटाने पे कुत्ता सेलिब्रेट करे. That is something we need to understand, that something very simple is being said. This is something we've known for centuries. Lekin scientifically in psychology, for the first time, a theory was being given that when something happens before something else, a relationship is formed through which the dog learns. And now remember that this is the time when modernism was at its peak. This is the time when the idea that man is just another animal was at its peak in the world of science. So what is happening here? What happens to the dog is a model for what happens in human beings. So several principles are being laid down here. It's not just a question of bell and meat. It's not just a question of a dog salivating. It's a question of a whole foundation of a paradigm. It's a question of a whole theoretical framework to be laid down. And what is that theoretical framework? Let's see. Let's have a look. There are several ways we can understand it. But one of the most important things here is that the first assumption is being made that man is an animal. So man learns just like animals. Man behaves just like animals. There's nothing unique, nothing superior, nothing amazing, nothing exceptional about a human being. That, I would say, changed psychology forever. That was the first assumption. What was the second assumption? The second assumption there was that if you want somebody to learn something, all you need to do is present that thing that you want them to learn with something else that they already know. So what would be typically a very complex educational method now could be simplified into very small bits of one stimulus and another stimulus. अब stimulus क्या होता है, response क्या चीज होती है, this is something we're going to dwell on in some depth today and in the next lectures. So what we're going to do now is have a look at the behaviorist perspective in some detail. So behaviorism जो है उसमें जैसे मैंने आपको कहा कि there are several ways it changed psychology forever. It not only created a new language, it also created a new philosophy, a new way of thinking. It simplified psychology to the bare bones, to the very basics. And for the first time, a strange promise was made. The promise that we can understand human behavior to the minutest by breaking it down to the smallest levels. कोई भी complex behavior हो, किसी किस्म का मसला हो, हम उसे छोटे छोटे टुकड़ों में बांट के समझ सकते हैं. That was the promise of behaviorism, and we will see how that promise was never to be fulfilled. That claim was never to see the light of day in terms of victory, in terms of fruition. So what was classical conditioning? Classical conditioning को classical इसलिए कहा गया कि वो conditioning की पहली discovery थी. तो कोई भी चीज जो बुनियादी तौर पे या असली तौर पे की जाती है उसको हम क्लासिकल कह देते. इसमें आप देखें, आई एम शोइंग यू अ स्लाइड हियर व्हिच सेज अनकंडीशनड स्टिमुलस लीड्स टू अनकंडीशनड रिस्पांस. पहला स्टेप क्या है, होता क्या है, कुत्ते के आगे गोश्त रखा है, एक अनकंडीशनड स्टिमुलस है. स्टिमुलस क्या चीज होती है, कोई भी सेंसेशन, कोई भी चीज, कोई भी हमारे माहौल में चीज हो जो हमारे लिए हमारे एहसासात उनको, हमारी सेंसेस को आके टच करे, उसको हम स्टिमुलस कहते हैं. वो एक लाइट हो सकती है, वो किसी की फिजिकल टच हो सकती है, वो एक स्मेल हो सकती है, वो कोई आवाज हो सकती है. ऑल ऑफ दीज थिंग्स आर कॉल्ड स्टिमुलाई. स्टिमुलाई प्लूरल है स्टिमुलस का, स्टिमुलस की जमा. तो अनकंडीशनड स्टिमुलस एक ऐसा स्टिमुलस जिसकी लर्निंग की जरूरत नहीं है, लेकिन वो खुद ब खुद एक रिस्पॉन्स पैदा करता है इंस्टिंक्ट के हवाले से. गोश्त कुत्ते के सामने आता है, कुत्ता सेलिवेट करता है, इसमें कुत्ते को सोचने की, सीखने की जरूरत नहीं है. ये एक नेचुरल बायोलॉजिकल रिस्पॉन्स है, कुदरती एक अमल है, इसमें कुत्ते का इख्तियार भी नहीं है. इट्स एन इनवॉलंटरी थिंग. ठीक है. तो अनकंडीशनड स्टिमुलस यानी गोश्त इस केस में क्या करता है, कुत्ते में एक अनकंडीशनड रिस्पॉन्स पैदा करता है, एक अनलर्नड रिस्पॉन्स पैदा करता है, एक कुदरती जिसे हम कहते हैं इंस्टिंक्टिव रिस्पॉन्स पैदा करता है। और उस इंस्टिंक्टिव रिस्पॉन्स का फायदा उठा के हम उसे लर्निंग करवा सकते हैं। कैसे? कि जिस स्टिमुलस को हमने सिखाना है, जिस चीज के जवाब में हमने रिस्पॉन्स लेनी है, यानी इस केस में घंटी, तो हम क्या करेंगे, घंटी जो है वो गोश्त देने से पहले बजाएंगे। तो क्या होगा, कंडीशनड स्टिमुलस इज प्रेजेंटेड नाउ बिफोर द अनकंडीशनड स्टिमुलस। यानी जो स्टिमुलस हमने सिखाना है उसे ऐसे स्टिमुलस से पहले पेश करेंगे जिसे सिखाने की जरूरत नहीं है। अनकंडीशनड स्टिमुलस कुदरती वो स्टिमुलस है जो एक ऑटोमेटिक रिस्पॉन्स कुत्ते में पैदा करता है। तो बेल इज रंग बिफोर द मीट इज गिवन। कंडीशनड स्टिमुलस इज प्रेजेंटेड बिफोर अनकंडीशनड स्टिमुलस। अब आपके लिए बहुत जरूरी है इस टर्मिनोलॉजी को समझें। Pay careful attention to this slide. It will be provided to you in the handout as well, but I want you to really learn it, and that is why I'm repeating this. Step 1, unconditioned stimulus leads to unconditioned response. Step 2, conditioned stimulus is presented before the unconditioned stimulus, and this is repeated over and over again until what happens? Conditioned stimulus leads to conditioned response. यानी conditioned stimulus क्या है यहाँ पे? घंटी। और conditioned response क्या है? salivation। अच्छा, अब वो saliva का ये लुआब दहन जिसे हम कहते हैं, थूक जो है, वो पहले तो हम उसे unconditioned response कह रहे थे, अब हम उसे conditioned response क्यों कह रहे हैं? वो इसलिए कि पहले वो गोश्त के जवाब में आ रही थी, तो इसलिए unconditioned response थी, कुदरती अमर था। अब घंटी के ऊपर स्लाइवा का निकलना, थूक का निकलना जो है, उसका क्या मतलब? उसका सिर्फ यही मतलब है कि कुत्ते ने सीख लिया है कि घंटी का गोश्त से कोई ताल्लुक है, और चूंकि गोश्त के जवाब में स्लाइवा बहता है, अब घंटी के जवाब में भी बहेगा। लेकिन जो यहाँ पे एक और अहम चीज समझने की है कि इस सारे अमर पे कुत्ते का इख्तियार कोई नहीं। He's learning this without having any control over the situation. It's an involuntary, गैर इरादी, it's an involuntary response and involuntary learning. ये वो learning नहीं है जैसे हम किताब में से कोई चीज पढ़ते हैं और जानबूझ के, सोच समझ के, लिख के, पढ़ के किसी चीज को याद करते हैं। Yet, there are so many things we can explain in this life by classical conditioning. Let me give you an example of classical conditioning in real life. हम अक्सर देखते हैं कि कई चीज़ों से हमें डर लगता है, कई चीज़ों से लोगों को कुदरती तौर पे डर लगता है। मसलन चूहा एक जानवर है और आमतौर पे लोग उससे बहुत डरते हैं। बाज़ लोग कहते हैं कि सिर्फ ख़वातीन डरती हैं, लेकिन मैंने बहुत मर्दों को भी चूहों से घबराते देखा। इसी तरह छिपकली एक और जानवर, जैसे ही वो कहीं नजर आती है या हिलती है तो लोग परेशान होना शुरू हो जाते। Let me tell you, there's nothing to be ashamed of here because it is a biological response. छिपकली या चूहे या इन जानवरों को अल्लाह ताला ने एक खास किस्म की शक्ल और शेप और हरकत दी है, और उस हरकत का मकसद जो है वो उन जानवरों का अपना दिफा है। वो ये चीज़ जो ये जो रिएक्शन है, मसलन छिपकली को इस तरह का रिएक्शन जो है सिर्फ इंसान ही नहीं देते, जानवर भी, कई जानवर जो हैं वो घबराते हैं। बाज़ों का देखा गया कि शेर जो है, शेर जैसा, जैसे हम कहते हैं ना, शेर से ज़्यादा बहादुर जानवर हमारी मैथोलॉजी में कहीं नहीं है। तो शेर जो है वो कई दफा देखा गया है कि छिपकली टाइप के जानवर से घबराता है, या कॉकरोच टाइप के जानवर से घबरा के पीछे हट जाता है। और उसकी वजह ये नहीं होती कि वो उससे कोई खौफजदा होता है जैसे हम कहते हैं, लेकिन वो एक कुदरती तौर पे एक ऐसी जो उन जानवरों की हरकत होती हैं और उनकी शक्लें होती हैं, वो तमाम मैमल्स के लिए, इंसान, शेर, कुत्ता वगैरह, इनके लिए प्रॉब्लमेटिक होती। तो पहली दफा जब बच्चे ने छिपकली देखी तो उसके साथ कोई और ऑब्जेक्ट भी पेयर हो गया, और अगर एक दफा से ज्यादा वो ऑब्जेक्ट जो है वो छिपकली के साथ पेयर हो जाता है तो लर्निंग ये हो जाती है कि जनाब वो चीज भी डरने वाली है, सिर्फ छिपकली डरने वाली नहीं है, कोई और चीज जो उसके साथ हो, मसलन कोई खिलौना हो सकता है, कोई रंग हो सकता है, could be a piece of cloth, could be anything that a child can fear. And that, I think, is the most important thing to understand here. That many of our learning in the childhood is not meaningful learning, but it is paired learning. मसलन कोई घर में कोई मेहमान आते हैं जो बच्चे को बहुत अच्छे लगते हैं, बच्चे को बहुत ज्यादा प्यार करते हैं, और वो हमेशा हरे रंग का लिबास पहनते हैं, तो बच्चे को हरा रंग पसंद आना शुरू हो जाता। Those are the kinds of things. अच्छा, अब उसे ये नहीं पता कि उसे हरा रंग क्यों पसंद। अच्छा, और वो लेट्स से कि 40 साल का, 50 साल का, 60 साल का हो जाता है इंसान, और उसे मरने तक ये नहीं पता चलता कि उसे हरा रंग क्यों पसंद आया ओरिजिनली। That could be the first few years that you had somebody very nice coming to your house wearing green clothes always. So that kind of pairing can produce lasting results. ठीक है ना? और इसमें इस तरह की, जैसे मैंने कहा कि एक्टिव लर्निंग नहीं है ये, this is passive learning, this is learning on which you have no control, and that learning is producing lasting results. Now, showing you another slide now. Here the principles of classical conditioning are being summed up in abbreviations, but it's a good idea to learn these. You have UCS producing UCR. UCS, unconditioned stimulus producing unconditioned response. The bell, UCS, producing saliva, UCR. Now you take the UCS and you pair it with the conditioned stimulus, and you take the UCS, which is the meat, you pair it with CS, which is the bell, and you produce the UCR, which is salivation. By repetition of this pairing between the bell and the meat, you produce the conditioned response. The conditioned stimulus, the bell, produces the conditioned response. Now, this I hope you will learn by heart. This I hope you will understand well. And if you don't, please communicate with your e-tutors. Ask them to explain it further to you. Give you more examples. Because I think it's very important to understand the fundamentals of classical conditioning if you want to understand the psychology of learning. And because we are here talking about forensic psychology, and we're talking here about learning how people learn violence, how people learn to be violent, how people learn to be aggressive towards others, how people learn to hurt others. We have to understand how people learn in the first place, how people learn anything, how people learn to associate one thing with another, how these things get connected in our minds. So, classical conditioning, once again, you have an unconditioned stimulus producing an unconditioned response, you have meat producing salivation. When you pair it with conditioned stimulus, CS, repeatedly you teach the dog to salivate to the bell. That example, if you understand fully, you will understand classical conditioning and will not forget it. Now let's talk about another thing. एक चीज हम कहते हैं जनाब, भूल जाते हैं, we forget, बट भूलना जो है वो उसका ताल्लुक मेमोरी से, और मेमोरी को किसी ने कभी देखा नहीं. बिहेवियरिज्म की प्रॉब्लम ये थी कि वो अनदेखी चीजों के बारे में थेरीज नहीं बनाते थे. तो उन्होंने कहा जनाब मेमोरी हमने कभी नहीं देखी, तो वी आर गोइंग टू ट्राई एंड अंडरस्टैंड हाउ एंड व्हाई पीपल forget what they have learned, how and why people lose what they have learned. एक तो चीज हो गई ना कि जनाब बेल बजी तो डॉग ने सेलिब्रेट करना शुरू कर दिया. क्यों? कि बेल को मीट से पहले पेश किया गया था. लेकिन अब क्या होता है, कुछ अरसे के बाद जब बेल बजाई तो डॉग ने सेलिब्रेट नहीं किया. क्या हुआ है उस दौरान? What happened? Extinction has taken place. What does extinction means? Extinction को हम समझते हैं ना, कोई चीज नापैद हो जाती है. जैसे डायनासोर्स के मामले में हम कहते हैं कि जी वो एक्सटिंक्ट हो गए. तो क्लासिकल कंडीशनिंग वालों ने जो कंडीशनिंग है उसकी एक्सटिंक्शन की बात की. ये कैसे होता है? पावलोव ने ये किया कि उसी कुत्ते के साथ घंटी बजानी शुरू कर दी, लेकिन घंटी के बाद गोश्त उसे नहीं दिया गया. तो अब क्या हुआ? शुरू में तो डॉग केप्ट सेलिब्रेटिंग, ठीक है ना, थूक उसी तरह बराबर कुत्ते की निकलती रही घंटी की आवाज सुन के. लेकिन कुछ 100 दफा जब घंटी बजाई गई और उसे गोश्त ना मिला तो कुत्ते ने रफ्ता रफ्ता घंटी की आवाज के जवाब में सेलिब्रेट करना बंद कर दिया. दैट इज व्हाट वी वुड कॉल extinction of the conditioned response. तो पावलोव ने सिर्फ यही डिस्कवर नहीं किया कि कंडीशनिंग कैसे होती है, उसने ये भी डिस्कवर किया कि एक्सटिंक्शन कैसे होती है उस लर्निंग की. यानी एक तरफ इंसान चीजें कैसे सीखता है, दूसरी तरफ उन्हें फिर सीखी हुई चीजों को कैसे भुलाता है. और यहां मैं इंसान कह रहा हूं, हालांकि पावलोव ने तो कुत्तों को इस्तेमाल किया. Now, this, brings us to the philosophical point, that is man another animal? Pavlov thought so. And Pavlov therefore concluded that if a dog learns a particular way, man must learn the same way. And that is where I think this attitude opened the door for a lot of scientific research, for a lot of scientific psychological research on animals to try and understand and predict human behavior. The approach had its problems and its critics, but one cannot deny the usefulness of what we have achieved through that line of experimentation. I want to emphasize the fact, I want to stress the fact that this is a fundamental philosophical issue. It's a philosophical issue because for some of us, man is more than an animal. And I think it's important to understand that. जब हम violence की बात करते हैं ना, तो हम कहते हैं इंसान नहीं है, जानवर है. और ये हम क्यों कहते हैं? I think we understand it also from our holy texts, that man is much more than an animal, but there is an animal in every man. And I think it's important to understand the distinction of what I am saying from what behaviorists have been saying. Behaviorists की position ये थी कि man is just another animal, and therefore any learning that an animal can do tells us about man's learning. I would say that some of us, a large number of us psychologists, do not accept that. And it could be because of religion, it could be because of other factors, other scientific factors as well. We take the position that man is not just another animal, but man does have an animal side, that it does have aspects of him that make him resemble a man. The Holy Quran talks about this. In one of the verses, God says that there are people who live on this earth like four-legged animals. And yet there are other people who are like birds soaring up to the skies. So this is an important thing to understand, that yes, there are some of us, in fact there is a very large number of us who live just like animals, no better than animals. And yet there are others whose spirits, whose eyes are always looking up to the sky like the birds. An important distinction. And important distinction with a view to understanding violence and man's nature, with a view to understanding our abilities, our skills, our propensities, our tendencies. So this is classical conditioning view, where our learning and our loss of learning is both understood through learning and loss of learning in dogs. So how does extinction work? If you look at the slide here, you will notice that conditioned stimulus is followed by no unconditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus is presented just before the unconditioned stimulus in conditioning. But if you take away the meat, if you take away the unconditioned stimulus, after repetition, you would find that the dog would not salivate to the bell, or conditioned stimulus will not produce conditioned response. Now, talking about classical conditioning, I want you to understand that I do not want you to take an anti-behaviorist stance just because behaviorists say that man is another animal. यहाँ पे जो अहम बात है ना, वो ये नहीं है कि behaviorist का फलसफियाना नुक्ता, जो फलसफियाना नुक्ता है कि man is an animal, गलत है या गलत नहीं है. That is not the important thing if we want to understand psychology. What is important is that it does tell us about a lot of learning that takes place at a very basic animal level in a human being. बात समझ आ रही कि एक बच्चा जब कुछ चीजें सीख रहा होता है, जैसे मैंने छिपकली की मिसाल दी थी और दूसरे जानवरों जिनसे डरता है बच्चा, तो वो बहुत सी उसमें लर्निंग एनिमल लेवल पे ही हो रही होती है. It's just like dog learning something. It's just like a cat learning something. It's just like a lion learning something. A child learns things at that level. तो यहाँ पे प्लीज इसे आइदर और ना बना लीजिए, ये ना बना लीजिए कि बिहेवियरिस्ट बिल्कुल गलत है. बिहेवियरिस्ट की जो कंट्रीब्यूशन है, क्लासिकल कंडीशनिंग की जो कंट्रीब्यूशन है इन आवर अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ द ह्यूमन बिहेवियर, ऑफ व्हाई people learn things. और जैसे मैंने आपसे कहा कि सिर्फ बच्चे ही नहीं एक तरह से लर्न करते, majority of people, as the Holy Quran says, many of men live like four-legged animals on this planet. So if a large majority of men live just like animals, they also learn like animals. And therefore, the importance of behaviorism in psychology, the importance of classical conditioning in psychology cannot be underestimated, cannot be overrated. ये चीज जो है मैं आपसे कहूंगा कि बिहेवियरिज्म को अच्छी तरह से समझें. साइकोलॉजी की हिस्ट्री में, साइकोलॉजी ऑफ वायलेंस की हिस्ट्री में इसका समझना बहुत जरूरी है. बहुत शुक्रिया. इंशाल्लाह नेक्स्ट टाइम मुलाकात होगी. खुदा हाफ़िज़.